Welcome to the new episode of Reflections from Dundee. My name is Nadia Sanderson and I'm the minister at Balgay Parish Church. For this episode, we will hear about the life story of one of Dundee's more elderly residents. It is a story that is full of commitment and sacrifice, that is inspiring. And it is a story that we so often miss when we don't listen and take the time to hear about our older neighbours and friends and relatives' life story that can be such an inspiration to us. So please take the time to listen to Harry's story, and he has helped to tell this story through his near neighbour, Piers.
Hello, my name is Piers. Welcome to Reflections from Dundee. As we head towards the end of 2020, most of us will be more than happy to leave the distressing difficulties of this year behind. However, I do hope that you have also experienced God's goodness in these troubled times. For me, for instance, one blessing during lockdown has been the opportunity to get to know my neighbours much better. You may be fortunate enough to be part of a community of good neighbours who look out for one another. For Christians, being a good neighbour is not just a cosy convenience. It lies at the heart of who we are. Jesus told us it is crucial to love your neighbour as yourself. And when he was challenged by the question, "Who is my neighbour?" he answered by telling the story of a foreigner who overcame religious and cultural prejudice by showing kindness and unconditional love to a complete stranger who had been beaten up, robbed and left for dead on a country road. Over the last few weeks and months, I have gradually come to learn the extraordinary story of a 92-year-old neighbour of ours called Harry, who showed selfless compassion to hundreds of innocent victims of war during their time of desperate need. And it is his story which really speaks to me about what it means to be a good neighbour in Jesus' sense of the word. I'd like to share his story with you now. Let me introduce you to Harry Gillan. He was born in 1928 and grew up in the hill town Dundee. He began his education at St Mary's Fourbank Primary School, which was run by Marist brothers. He loved playing football with the brothers and remembers the thrill of being taken on a school trip to the Victoria Theatre, where, as part of a live circus act, he saw his first elephant. He was 12 when World War II broke out, and after being evacuated for a few enjoyable weeks to the seaside in Montrose, he returned and resumed his secondary education at Lochee Academy. A year later, he travelled across Scotland to St Joseph's College, Dumfries, where he was given his new religious name, Raphael, and began his vocational path to becoming a fully fledged Marist brother at the age of 17. Having proved himself to be fluent in French and good at Spanish, he originally wanted to be a modern languages teacher, but because of his additional talent for maths, he was persuaded by his provincial superior to study science at university instead. So, Brother Raphael went off to live in Glasgow, where he stayed with his fellow Marists in St Kentigern's Hostel, Partick Hill. 4 years later, he graduated with a BSc in Maths and Astronomy from Glasgow University. He followed this up with a year's teacher training at Jordanhill College. Brother Raphael's teaching career began briefly back in his old school in Dumfries. However, after only 3 months there, he was invited to go to a newly opened school in Nigeria to be a science teacher. He jumped at the chance. It was a big adventure for a young man who had grown up in relatively poor circumstances in the hill town Dundee. Having raised enough money to buy duplicators for his new West African school, Harry set sail on a 3-week voyage from Liverpool via Lisbon and the Canaries to Nigeria. He was grateful to get his own cabin, having been upgraded from 3rd to 2nd class by a sympathetic shipping agent who knew his background. Whilst he was on his way, he was shocked to find that some of the Africans who came on board ship in the latter part of the voyage had to make do with sleeping on the top decks, where they were unprotected from the weather. 300 miles off the coast of West Africa, he detected a change in the scent of the warm sea breeze. That's the smell of Africa, he was told. Harry arrived in Port Harcourt in Christmas 1953 and headed up the east side of the mighty River Niger to Owerri, the capital of Imo State, and from there he journeyed northwards to Bishop Shanahan College to take up his new appointment. The school was situated in Eluamu village near Orlu, 14 miles from the River Niger. The village had a post office which boasted a radio transmitter that could send messages to the outside world. The main aim of the college was to educate the less privileged but capable young men who could be brought up in the Catholic faith. The school had originally been established in 1949 by the Irish Order of the Holy Ghost Fathers, but two Irish Marists from Athlone had taken it over early on, and gradually the school grew year by year. It had only been going for 2 years by the time Harry arrived, so the first intake of pupils was entering their 3rd year. Harry was their first teacher with a science qualification. At its capacity, there were about 350 pupils on the school roll. The college was situated on the edge of a plateau above a rift valley. There was plenty of untamed bush surrounding them, and Brother Raphael, as he was then, once saw a group of leopards that had wandered over from the neighbouring valley. It wasn't the best place to take a walk in the moonlight, he remarked. Nigeria was still a part of the British Empire in those days, and the government awarded the school an annual grant of £22,000, which allowed them to subsidise the pupils' school fees, to the extent that the parents were only asked to pay £15 a year towards their children's education. Given his own socialist principles and relatively humble background, Harry had many misgivings about the ethics of charging school fees to poor families, but he accepted reluctantly that it was a fact of life that it couldn't function any other way. Unlike other orders where priests improved their income after their ordination, the Marists believed that they should live at the same basic level as the people that they taught, so they simply earned the same salary as the local teachers. What you are doing in teaching Christianity, stated Harry, is you're teaching equality. Most of the pupils in the school were termed day boarders, meaning that they came from different primary schools all around the region and were lodged with local families in the neighbouring village. Other pupils were day pupils who lived within a 5-mile radius of the school, still able to walk to school and home again every day. Eventually, the school built enough dormitories to house all their boarders on their premises. There were as many as 5 different local languages spoken by the pupils who had come from around the region. During the 1950s, only about 4% of the local population in this area of Imo State had any real understanding of Christianity, and there were still some brutal traditional practices going on. When an important local chief died, for instance, many of his people came to Shanahan College for sanctuary and slept in the corridors for protection, as they were fearful of being decapitated by the chief's henchmen who wanted to place their severed heads in their leader's grave as part of his ritual burial. The school had night watchmen armed with bows and arrows, accompanied by a guard dog that helped to keep their precincts secure. Harry also brought electric power and light to their community by installing a generator and wiring the whole school compound himself, and when anything broke down, Harry would happily turn his hand to fixing it. Parents of the pupils were grateful for the safe environment that the college created for their children, and sometimes brought presents of hens to the staff to show their appreciation for protecting them. As the school developed over the years, it gained a reputation for giving its pupils a good, solid education. Through their hard work and determination, Brother Raphael and his colleagues turned their school into a successful place of learning. Indeed, many notable Nigerian professionals, doctors, lawyers, engineers, and other national leaders were given an excellent start in life. Their success drew them to the attention of their British external examiners. One year, our school in Nigeria got a visit from 2 guys from the Cambridge Exam Board, who were curious to find out why our school had got such high results, particularly in technical education. It turned out that the examiners had set their questions by lifting them, word for word, from a textbook from New Zealand that Harry's school had been using to teach their pupils. The pupils had been well taught, and had obviously been surprised and delighted to see familiar questions reappearing in their exam. The examiners went away satisfied by what they had been told, but feeling rather sheepish. In October 1960, Nigeria gained its independence from Britain. Most of the teachers in Bishop Shanahan College expected to be thrown out of the country at that point, but they were allowed to continue to teach as before. In simple terms, the new nation of Nigeria, which is roughly 3.5 times the size of the UK, was a post-colonial ad hoc federation of 55 million people comprised of 200 racial groups, of which the three principal ones were the Fulani and Hausa in the north, who were predominantly Muslim, the Yoruba to the west of the Niger River, and the Igbo from the eastern region which borders Cameroon, the area where Harry was teaching. Unfortunately, after independence, inter-ethnic tensions soon surfaced, leading to power struggles, military coups and counter-coups. In the midst of all this political turmoil, Brother Raphael was promoted to principal of Bishop Shanahan College in 1965. As head teacher, Harry was now about to face the biggest challenge of his life. Between June and October 1966, intertribal prejudice and mounting political tensions resulted in the massacre of 30,000 Igbo people in the north of the country, which, in turn, led hundreds and thousands of Igbos to migrate back to their ethnic homeland in the southeast, and caused a political movement for secession for the predominantly Igbo territory. Lieutenant Colonel Emeka Ojukwu, the military governor of the eastern region, declared in the independence of this oil-rich territory as the Republic of Biafra on the 30th of May 1967. And so it was, some 13 years after he arrived in Nigeria, that Harry found himself in the centre of a terrible civil war that led to the deaths of an estimated 3.5 million people, most of whom were starving children. It was, in Harry's words, a nasty, nasty war. As the better equipped Nigerian Federal Army slowly gained the upper hand, they encircled Biafra, capturing its vital seaports and imposing a total blockade that strangled the country economically and gradually led to the mass starvation of its civilian population. During this time of crisis, schools closed, staff fled, pupils left and headed home. Harry also helped to coordinate and facilitate the evacuation of Europeans from the area. He gave his teachers 3 months' salary and told them to go home. The married staff took their children and left, but a couple of unmarried African teachers decided to stay at the school. Harry put all the school's valuable equipment into specially constructed wooden boxes, placed them in secure storage and awaited developments. He stayed in the war zone because, he said, "I didn't want our local neighbours to think that we were only there for the good times." In September 1967, a fellow Scottish marist called Norbert Sims travelled south from Enugu to Orlu. Raphael and Norbert were close friends who had known each other since the age of 13 when they had been schoolmates together in Dumfries. Norbert was vice principal of the Marists' other college at Enugu, 80 miles north of Orlu. But as the federal forces closed in on the city, Brother Norbert was forced to flee south. At this point in time, as Norbert headed south, Raphael was actually on leave 300 miles away over the eastern border in Bamenda, Cameroon. Unexpectedly, news came through that the Biafran Ministry of Education was considering reopening their schools. So Brother Ignatius set off to find Brother Raphael so that he could plan for their college to resume teaching. It took him many days and many questions at roadblocks along the way before Ignatius reached Cameroon. So Harry left the safety of Bamenda and began his dangerous return journey back into the Biafran war zone. They were only just able to pass through the last remaining gap in the blockade before it was sealed off. Raphael and Ignatius went for 2 days without any food and almost gave up, but still they kept going. We must have walked about 100 miles on foot, Harry recalled. The locals were delighted when Brother Raphael reappeared in Orlu. To be with them in their hours of suffering was something that they deeply appreciated. A few weeks later, the Calabar road was closed, and Biafra became a totally landlocked country, whose only access to the outside world was by plane from Port Harcourt. The school never reopened during the war, for in December 1967, while Harry was on a brief visit to Uturu, the Biafran army requisitioned the college, taking over the dormitories and classrooms and using them as a training headquarters. They set about pressing local men and boys to join their makeshift army. The playing fields became training grounds for the new recruits that included some of their senior pupils. Harry was allowed to keep the use of his office in the school thanks to the intervention of the traditional ruler of the area, His Majesty Eke Patrick Achilono. He was a small, clever and well-educated man who spoke perfect English with a South African accent and provided a valuable service to his community by translating documents from English into Igbo. By this time, the religious community at the mothballed school consisted of brothers Raphael, Norbert, Ignatius and Louis from Britain, and 2 African brothers who had been trained in Uturu. An ever-increasing number of refugees fleeing the fighting began converging on the area around Orlu. Some of them sought shelter in the empty school buildings before the army evicted them. So while the Biafran army was busy turning the school into a barracks, Harry and his colleagues began using their base to scour the countryside looking for food, and Norbert took steps to open a small health clinic. Harry would take a lorry and go into big villages in a desperate search for any food stores that they could find.
There are a lot of big villages which had good stores and that kind of thing. They were all abandoned. Mm-hmm. And we went around and looted them for food, and bring it back to the on the door. I had a big school about 200 to 300, and room for that number of boarders, and we had a lot of abandoned children, mothers with babies. And
Harry's role had now changed from running a secondary school to using his local knowledge and experience to coordinate the distribution of vital emergency relief aid. At one point, there were as many as 50 refugee camps in the area surrounding Orlu. The local Igbos would often try to ambush their lorry. On one occasion, a group of armed militiamen stopped them at a roadblock, and their leader ordered Harry to hand over your food or we'll kill you. Harry refused, and sensing a momentary hesitation by his would-be assassin, he wrenched the gun from the startled militiaman's grasp and hurled it into the bush. He still isn't too sure exactly what happened next, but he does remember that he suddenly hit the ground with considerable force. Apparently, some friendly Igbos who knew him had leapt on top of him and shielded him from being shot by the rest of the gun-toting militia. Mercifully, Harry escaped with a rather large bump on his head, and his lorry with its precious cargo was able to carry on its way. Running a relief effort so close to a military training camp made the school a target for the Federal Air Force. Harry remembers hearing the sound of drums from villages in the valley below beating out their warning that an enemy plane was on its way. He was sent diving for cover as the school and its grounds were riddled with machine gun fire from a Federal plane. He could only pray that the concrete floor above him would keep him safe. "I was never frightened," said Harry stoically. "God looks after you." With the fall of Port Harcourt to the Federal forces in June 1968, the Biafrans suffered the loss of its crucial airport. A replacement was urgently needed, so they cordoned off a stretch of the highway at Uli, 27 miles southwest of Orlu, on the main road to Owerri. This served them as a small improvised airfield, codenamed Annabelle, which was used to bring vital supplies and emergency relief into the besieged country. On the opposing side, Egyptian pilots were employed by the Federal Army to bomb the Biafran positions, and Harry remembers 2 of their planes being shot down. By the middle of 1968, international press coverage of the war had gradually made the outside world aware of the humanitarian catastrophe that was befalling Biafra, and a Save Biafra international campaign was launched. British war correspondent Frederick Forsyth wrote, "The World Council of Churches helped to buy some clapped-out freighter aircraft and gained permission from Portugal to use the offshore island of São Tomé as a base. Scandinavian pilots and crew, mostly airline pilots, offered to fly without pay. Joint Church Aid was quickly nicknamed Jesus Christ Airlines, and thus came into being the world's only illegal Mercy air bridge. This became the basis for a huge international humanitarian relief effort that transported food and medicine to Biafra. It was the largest civilian airlift of any kind ever carried out. This was achieved through a series of joint efforts by Protestant and Catholic church groups and other non-governmental organizations operating civilian and military aircraft with mostly volunteer civilian crews and support personnel. Several national governments also supported the effort, mostly from behind the scenes. This sustained joint undertaking lasted 1.5 times as long as the more famous Berlin airlift. It is estimated to have saved more than 1 million lives by bringing in, at its peak, 500 tons of supplies daily. During 2 years of flying over 5,000 Mercy missions, 25 Joint Church Aid pilots and a crew were killed. So, in one of the ironies of the war, compassionate folk in the UK were doing their best to raise the money needed to feed the starving children of Biafra while their own government was providing the Nigerian Federal Army with the military hardware they required to maintain the ever-tightening blockade that was just as surely killing thousands of the very same children and the pilots of the Mercy missions that were trying to help them. One Nigerian colonel even admitted that starvation was being used deliberately as a weapon of war. In September 1968, the International Committee of the Red Cross estimated that almost 10,000 people were dying daily from starvation caused by Nigeria's blockade. Harry and his band of brothers got some limited food supplies from the airlift. It was helpful, he said, but even so it was just a drop in the ocean. As the situation grew more desperate, Harry, Norbert and Ignatius drove a lorry 30 miles north to Onitsha, a large city on the banks of the Niger, which had become a major focus of operations for the Nigerian forces approaching from the west. In spite of its commercial significance, the city and its surrounding villages were completely deserted by the time Harry arrived with his truck. Roughly 2/3 of the population of Onitsha at that time came from other parts of Nigeria, and they had fled the fighting as the Federal Army launched their repeated attacks. The Biafran Army repelled the Federal offensives 3 times when they tried to cross the river, and evidence of the recent fighting was all too apparent to the brothers as they arrived in the war-torn town.
The only noise you heard in the nature was vultures landing on the corrugated island.
Mm-hmm.
Vultures came from all over West Africa to places like Niger.
Mm-hmm.
Bodies everywhere. The smell was horrific.
Mm-hmm.
We went to the hospital and stripped it of everything of any use.
Oh, okay.
And we filled the lorry. Went away with an empty lorry and came back with it absolutely full. We had 2 fridges in actual fact and more other things. It was a stormy Monday. sorry.
No, it's okay. Listening at night to the World Service on his radio while lying on his bed in that empty hospital in Onitsha, Harry could hear the BBC's war correspondent, Frederick Forsyth, only 20 miles away, saying, "You can hear the fighting still going on." But Harry couldn't hear a sound, he said. There wasn't a sound happening round about us, but he had the sounds of bombs going off. Famine and starvation were now rife in the besieged enclave. Small, severely malnourished children with distended bellies, rheumy eyes, and fairish grey hair, discoloured by a lack of protein, urgently needed food, but so too did their mothers. Many were so desperate that they consumed the bottles of baby food intended for their infants. When Harry challenged one of them about this, she replied, "We can always make more children." That frightened me, Harry recalled, still haunted by the memory of her fatalism.
Very frightening, you know. So, some of the things you hear, maybe I've told you this before, I mean, we've got so many children wandering about, and I'm not naked, this height, totally lost, totally abandoned.
So these were not your school pupils, these were just orphans who'd been abandoned?
When all this kind of thing happened, the parents ran and took the children who were able to keep with them, but that was about it. They were not lumbering themselves.
Some of those who didn't survive had to be buried by the brothers themselves. Nevertheless, through their endeavours, they still saved mothers and children from starvation. In October 1968, in just one example among countless others, a young mother came in from a village 7 miles away for food and medicine for her tiny 6-month-old baby. But while Brother Raphael was getting some fish for her, the baby stopped breathing. The brothers tried their own brand of artificial resuscitation and rushed the child to a nearby hospital, where they discovered that the mother, lacking any milk of her own, had tried to feed it thick cassava meal called gari, which in her baby's weakened condition it couldn't hope to digest. Soon the baby was breathing again, and after a week of treatment, she took her baby home. Near the end of the war, the father came back to let them know that their baby, Ignatius, was well. The Igbo troops were also hungry. Sometimes they would fire their rifles in the air and drive the refugees away so that they could help themselves to the great cauldrons of thick soup that Harry and his colleagues had prepared in the school kitchen for the starving masses.
I don't know what weight I am just now, but I used to run about 10 stone 4. At the end of that war, I was 6.5 stone.
Wow. It was such a stupid war, said Harry. Nobody knew what was going on. It was just a total shambles. There were sects of the Igbo who were fighting among themselves, as they were just looking after themselves. The war wiped out some of the best kids I knew, he said. Despite the desperate resistance of the Biafran army fighting against fearsome odds, by 1969, the federal troops had advanced steadily towards the heart of the Igbo territory. On the 30th of June, 1969, Nigeria banned international relief from the Red Cross to Biafra. By this time, the novitiate at Uturu, 35 miles east of Orlu, was under the threat of bombardment, and Brother Raphael was asked by the bishop, who was still in charge of his diocese, to go there and persuade the trainees to evacuate. Harry did so, but he was captured by the Nigerian army in the process. He never did return to Orlu. Brother Norbert and the others had to carry on the work as best they could, feeding the refugees while under constant threat of attack. Harry was now a prisoner, marooned in a mud hut in the jungle. Fortunately for him, their captors treated them well. He was only there for a couple of weeks. When it got dark one night, he said to himself, "I'm not staying here," and just slipped away under cover of darkness. The Federal Army were mainly desert people from the north who were frightened of the jungle, especially at night, when, as Harry said, "The monkeys are shouting to everybody, 'There are lions and leopards about!'" And so Harry just escaped. He moved from village to village, using whatever means of transport he could find. There were abandoned empty cars everywhere. He refueled his vehicles by taking a rubber tube to siphon off the petrol or diesel that he needed. And so he journeyed eastwards towards Cameroon, scavenging whatever food he could find as he went along. But the Cross River was a significant obstacle in his way.
Not a river to kind of cross unless you're on a good solid canoe. The crocodiles there had worked out how to tumble small canoes.
Right, okay.
You wouldn't believe them, would you?
No.
I mean, they look such vicious, kind of ugly, and you think they were stupid as well, you know, but they're not. I bet you they're still doing it.
16 years after arriving in Nigeria, a small, exhausted, undernourished, homeless Scottish refugee on the run called Brother Raphael crossed the border back to the sanctuary of Cameroon and travelled onwards to Bamenda. He never returned to the school he loved and had devoted his life to. From Bamenda he was sent to recuperate at the general headquarters of the Marist brothers in Rome. He found them to be very kind and helpful. The war ended on the 15th of January 1970. Harry's 3 missionary colleagues, brothers Norbert, Louis and Ignatius, were taken prisoner and held captive in an insanitary, overcrowded jail in Port Harcourt, where they were sentenced to 6 months' hard labour for pleading not guilty to aiding the enemy. In truth, what they, along with Harry, had been guilty of was feeding the poor, tending the sick, and housing the homeless. Brother Norbert estimated that, between them, they had fed 2,000 children. Fortunately, the world's press got news of their plight, and the 3 brothers were deported and forbidden to return. Several times in the midst of the suffering he witnessed in Biafra, Harry found himself asking, "Where is God in all this?" The sheer horror of what he had witnessed inevitably left its emotional scars on him, though he said that during the war he'd never shed a tear. The tears came later. He left the order of the Marist brothers and wandered the highlands of Scotland like a lost soul for several months. He stopped reading his Bible, but gradually, over time, he began to pick up the pieces of his life and recovered his faith again, living for a short while in Wolverhampton, teaching for a year in Newcastle before going to take up the post of principal teacher of maths at Perth's High School. Soon after this, his hometown came calling, and head teacher Brother Bede invited him to apply for the position of deputy head at St. John's High School, back in Dundee. This was a post which he held for 17 years until he retired in 1992. When I asked Harry about his abiding memories of his time in southeastern Nigeria, his reply was positive. "I made a lot of good friends out there," he smiled. "There was a football team from Nigeria that came here to Dundee quite recently. The guy who was managing them was actually a former pupil of mine. He came to see me. They got some terrific results." All in all, in spite of experiencing the terrible suffering of the Biafran War, Harry is still grateful for his years in West Africa, for the friends he made and the lessons he learned. "It was a great time for learning," he said. "It changed me. I was a very arrogant young man when I went out there, but he is rightly proud of what he and his band of brothers achieved." It's been a privilege for me to learn about my neighbour Harry's remarkable story of commitment, courage, sacrifice and compassionate Christian service 50 years ago in a dreadful, forgotten war in a corner of West Africa. I think you'll agree that Harry is a wee man with a big heart. His life as Brother Raphael reminds me what it means to love my neighbour, and it makes me think of Sidney Carter's song with Jesus' question to all of us. When I needed a neighbour, were you there? Were you there? When I needed a neighbour, were you there? May God bless you and keep you safe. Cheerio for now.
Whoa! Stay where you are.
I'm glad you let me have things for a long way in. I don't feel any different. I didn't really want to look at it.
When I needed a neighbor, were you there? Were you there? When I needed a neighbor, were you there? And the creed and the color of the name won't matter, were you there?
Well, I hope that you found Harry's story of commitment and sacrifice and love for his neighbour to be as inspiring as I found it. Such a genuine way of showing God's love for the hungry and the poor and the imprisoned. So I hope that you do take the time to listen to others to tell their story, and there is so much that we can learn. For next time, for Reflections from Dundee, we'll be hearing from Roderick, the minister at Lochee, and he will be talking about Christmas and light. So until next time, God bless.